Well, I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of the symposium to invite me to join the symposium this year. I had the chance to speak several years ago in person at the symposium, so I really remember that very well. And I'm happy that this time I can join virtually from my apartment in Washington, D.C. It's a different experience, but you know, we will make it work. I know that the title of my presentation is Beyond Resilience. And what I'm actually going to talk about is about the concept of acceleration. And acceleration that I notice in the thinking that our museums do these days about who they are and where they need to be, how it was before the pandemic and what it should become after, and considering the pandemic period as a sort of an acceleration of the conversation that we had before. So what I mean is that before the pandemic, several conversations were going on in the field, and they seemed never to find an outcome or trigger new practices. We were speaking about relevance to the community and public engagement, but except for a few examples, we were still operating in one form or another on the deficit model. My point will be that because of the COVID-19, these conversations have taken a new turn. However, if we are not careful and do not operate the transition well, it may well have been in vain. First, a little bit of the context about the pre-COVID conversations. In the summer of 2019, I had a chance to be running a survey amongst many US science centers and museums about their new plans for climate change exhibitions and programs. And the majority of them responded with the current view of becoming more community relevant by addressing strategies of resilience. And as much as this is valuable, this is mainly addressing the symptoms rather than the cause. Understand me well, this can be great plans and influence the community in a very important way. One example, the Science Museum of Virginia created the Citizen Science Project to address the urban heat island effect. They created a number of devices that people could carry in their cars or on bikes and follow pre-designed routes at pre-designed times of the day and really map the temperature of the city at very specific times of the day. This is very important because when the cities cool down at night, not all the areas cool down in the same way. And what the Citizen Science Project found was that these areas where senior citizens lived were the ones that suffered the most from the heat at night. So that allowed the city to take proactive actions to prevent the seniors or to help them when the temperature was very high. And we know that high temperatures can be very important and sometimes lethal to old people. So I was really excited about seeing a multiplication of such programs. But then one CEO of a science center in Florida came back to me and said, what about attacking the cause? The carbon emissions by industry and the food industry, etc. Will we as science centers continue to pretend that we cannot tell people what to do, to give them ideas to participate in actions even when they are based on scientific evidence? This question actually reflects the whole paralysis of the field, of this single, very widespread conviction that science centers cannot become political activists because they will lose the trust of their audiences. So let's look into the trust issue to start with. It's generally admitted that science centers and science museums benefit from the trust of their audience. Figures vary depending on the source, but generally we can admit that about 85%, even more, of our audience mostly trust or totally trust the information they find in science centers and museums. This is considered our principal selling point, our most precious asset, and maybe that is why we have not been digging deeper in what trust really means. Well, someone did. At the Perot Museum in Texas, a science center heavily sponsored by oil companies, the director of research started a research protocol to analyze the trust of museum audiences in the climate science presented by the museum. And to do so, she used the 6 Americas model from Yale University about the attitudes of the US population about climate change. And the six Americas model creates six populations in the United States, from the alarmed, which are those who are the most concerned and convinced that global warming is happening, to the dismissive or doubtful, who doubt the whole thing. And so at this point, about 60% are concerned or alarmed, and about 20% are dismissed. So she looked at the visitors of her museum, and she found that even they were more alarmed than the average Americans. And so she tested, and it looked like an expected outcome that visitors of science museums are more concerned about climate change. However, she then organized workshops with specific groups, with the alarmed, the most concerned people about climate change, and the dismissive separately. And she tried to figure out how they actually found the science presented in the museum. And so the outcomes were quite different. When it comes to the views about academia and research, the alarmed people would say something like, the information comes from people that have devoted their lives to research, so they are trustworthy. The doubtful would say things like, quite honestly, there are a number of institutions that are biased, and I would not trust Harvard, for example. When it comes to sponsorship and corporations, the alarmed would say something like, the Perot family, which sponsor the museums, makes a lot of money with oil and fossil fuels, which is a reason not to trust the information. And the doubtful would say, people who point towards a bias because of the oil sponsorships have an agenda on their own. So there's quite very different views about trust in the information. So obviously trust is a very complex matter. And when it comes to put science into action, that trust may or may not be affected. So Colleen Dillenschneider, who is a well-known researcher in the US, has explored this further recently, and here are some other findings. Are museums trusted because they are not seen as having a political agenda? Maybe or maybe not. When an organization's mission itself may be viewed as politicized, where does an organization draw the line? What's an organization to do when facts become politicized? Museums are increasingly taking up issues that are in line with their mission, marching in pride parades in the name of inclusion, hosting naturalization ceremonies, and reminding the public that facts matter, and yet people do not see museums as political so far. On the contrary, people believe that museums should suggest, recommend certain behaviors or ways for the general public to support their causes. This is likely tied to the combined force of high levels of trust and credibility that those organizations possess. Recommending action is not the same as being political. This is confirmed by many other studies, like the ones organized in zoos and aquariums, that systematically find since 10 years that the ask of the public for guidance in matters of conservancy and protection of biodiversity is constantly growing, and also is the frustration not to find it in the zoos and the aquariums as much as they do. It is in that context that we have seen the dramatic controversy about the new museums definition proposed by ICOM, the International Council of Museums. In a nutshell, after a long preparation, ICOM came up with a new definition that included the role of museums in addressing global challenges and work on social justice issues, recognizing the cultural differences existing in the world. And as we all know, the leadership was not able to bring this new definition to a vote during the General Assembly in Kyoto in 2019. Because of the frustration about the process that was not transparent enough, which might or may not be true, but also because there were critics from different sides, scientists warning about the shift from scientific evidence towards culture, and others finding that museums should not be social activists. Finally, in this pre-COVID period, another movement started before COVID troubled everything. Responding to the Black Lives Matter movement and inspired by some at museums, some professionals in museums, the museums are not neutral started. The movement affirms, and I quote, "The very fact that this field has a long history of excluding and marginalizing people of color in terms of selection, interpretation, and care of art and other objects, jobs, visitor services, board representations, and more indicates that museums are political spaces." And then COVID strikes. COVID strikes before a significant movement towards new vision for museums came about. Despite all these conversations, nothing changed very much in what we think museums should look like. Now, we all know what happened and what dramatic consequences the pandemic has and will have on the field. No one can ignore this, and it is a societal disaster. However, something very unexpected happened. Very quickly, new concepts and new behaviors appeared. And if I had to summarize in terms of what they mean for science museums fields, I would say this. People gained or regained trust in experts in science. People are willing to change attitudes and behaviors under immediate threat. People are questioning if the pre-COVID-19 societal model is sustainable and are open to new models. Underserved populations have been hit the hardest by COVID-19, which triggered a new debate on social justice. COVID also revealed the scope of the digital divide that exists. In the midst of the pandemic, the famous young activist Greta Thunberg and renowned scientist Johan Rockström sat together in a video conference hosted by the Nobel Museum in Stockholm. And they agreed that these were actually all elements that could be seen as signs of hope for a post-COVID climate change action plan. And as far as I am concerned, they are elements for a new vision for museums as well. It is incredible how this came about in a few months, where 30 years of struggling with the deficit model has not moved the needle that much. But here are the challenges that we will need to overcome if we want to solidify the change. As we have seen signs of hope for museums during the pandemic, a few things became clear as well. And maybe this is the most important one. We do not seem to matter to people as much as we think we do, which is a bit frustrating, isn't it? First, from the data museum surveys, we can see that people are much more worried about the survival of restaurants and local businesses rather than reopening of museums. 75% versus 30%. That's huge difference. Only 16% of current regular museum goers are fans consider contributing financially to museums to survive the crisis. When asked what people would lose most if a museum disappears, they classify from more important to less important. On top, the loss of identity, the loss of learning opportunities, the loss of economic impact, the loss of inclusion opportunities, and finally, well-being. That's worrisome because the expectation is that well-being is what visitors will look for, and they obviously do not associate museums with well-being. Second, and somehow linked, museums need to heal. They need to heal emotionally, mentally, and physically. They need to provide knowledge and opportunities for people to escape the daily life. But the very important conclusion of statement that comes out of that survey says, if the museums want to be relevant in the future, they cannot wait for this to be over to try to heal. They may not be as impactful. And what it is that we see today most of the time and too often is that museums are stuck in strategies for reopening and survival and not in conversations about what they should look like in the future. This reflects the conflict of focusing on reopening safely and have a vision for the future that will include exhibitions and programs focusing on safety, health, and well-being as a result of a co-creation process with the community. Third, the need to be inclusive. We all speak about that. But in the US, COVID has affected Black and Latino minorities much harder than any other. On average, there are 2.8 times more cases of and death in these communities. That is the result of socioeconomic factors such as poverty, type of jobs these communities can access living conditions, but also from underlying conditions such as asthma, diabetes, obesity related to socioeconomic ones. The problem is that these communities are not our visitors. How are we going to be inclusive if we do not build more aggressive strategies to reach them where they are and listen to what their needs are? Fourth, the big corporations and some major countries such as Canada and India and others are considering strategies to bounce back from the economical crisis linked to COVID-19 by building on oil and coal, which is a setback from all the green economy plans that we had. As a conclusion, I would go back to this famous quote that says, "Give a family a fish and they will eat a day. Teach them to fish and they will eat forever." And propose a new one that I have picked up somewhere, don't remember where exactly. Give a family a fish is a charitable act. Teach a family to fish is creating sustainability, but organize a community-based intergenerational fishing collective is participating in social change. Science centers and museums must be able to rethink their mission in such a way that they will be able to respond to the new expectations from a traumatized audience by being very humble and at the service of their audiences, not thinking that they bring something to the community needs, but listen in the first place to what it is the community thinks they need. And enter in a new partnerships made by all those locally who want to participate in the co-creation of a new museum. Thank you.